No, that sounds pretty good. I was just wondering, and maybe Robin can chip in on this. Robin, did we want to record this session to make it available to colleagues after the fact?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so if everyone's okay with that, can I just get a thumbs up that everyone's okay with being recorded? Okay, fantastic. All right, excellent. And there's Professor Andrew Samuels. Hello, sir. Oh my goodness, Professor John Eisler as well. There's Andrew. Excellent. So I'll just start off, you know, and again, I envision this more as a question and answer period. I'm sorry if some of you were hoping for a lecture, but it's not going to be quite the case, but we'll see how things go. But obviously I've written a paper about my own experiences and a paper really kind of forwarding an anti-racist stance. And ultimately, I think what I was trying to do in the paper was to kind of combine this more academic approach and coming from a more feeling place and speaking to my own subjectivity. But as it stands, it's a paper that is forwarding an anti-racist approach, but equally, I want to note my own privilege and my own privileged positions, even though I've kind of written this paper. So yes, I am from a minority ethnic background. I am Chinese, I'm Cantonese specifically, but I was born and raised in Canada. And my accent and the way I speak already gives me a certain amount of privilege over and above others who are Chinese and who are born in different contexts and speak differently. And while I'm not from a wealthy family, I grew up poor, but my family was eventually able to claw, if you will, to this lower middle class status in Canada. I was raised in a family where education was prized and my pursuits were, for the most part, encouraged, other than the topic of study. I would say when I sold my parents, I was going into psychology and not even mentioning Jung yet. They were not that supportive. So it took some time, if you will, to get that support. But the reason I'm just saying this is for everyone just to, or asking everyone just to keep in mind their own positions of privilege and to approach our discussion with openness and an awareness of how our words can impact others and to embrace the opportunity we have here of learning from others who may not share our worldviews and our various privileged positions. And that's it. And with that, I'd just like to open it up to any questions, comments from our colleagues here. And again, Marissa will be monitoring the chat function and any other requests to speak.
Just a reminder, if you have just hopped on, if you would like to ask a question, please just type WTS into the chat and I will flag your question and give you a moment to speak.
I see Professor Izod's box blinking. There he is. Did you have a question, John?
How long will the next one hold? It's kind of quivering a bit, but so I may have to come and go, but I'll do what I can to keep in touch. Well, shyness abounds everywhere, so I guess I ought to introduce myself as, which I think a colonialized child, one of the white exploitative school kids in the middle of Africa. Oh, I've lost you.
Yeah, I think you cut out there, John, briefly there.
Possibly back now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. It was just a remark by way of offering a presence of somebody whose background, not foreground, but whose background was completely other than the colonial one.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. There's Sean, hello.
Hi, Kevin, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Excellent.
Kevin, this is Andrew. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Andrew. How are you?
I'm okay. I want to get the ball rolling. This is the only Zoom event I've ever been on that starts on time. Anyway, so it always takes a little while for things to settle down. Your paper was published, I think, in 2019. Is that right?
2020.
2020, sorry. And it's arrived in the most race-conscious period in Western politics that I can remember since the 60s.
Mm.
And I'm just wondering, could you mute Sean? Sean, you need to mute. Thanks. I was just wondering about the reception that the paper received, not only on the IAJS recently, but also since it was published, or even before it was published, when these ideas you were talking about them. And I don't just mean factually, but what is your evaluation of the reception of the paper, especially in the Jungian communities, because there is stuff in the Jungian area that is really quite difficult to absorb and to understand the full implications of in some of the quotes from Jung. And well, you know, the kind of thing I'm trying to get you to do is to speak about the response you've received to this paper. Mm-hmm. And then maybe people will have, or I might have a question or comment about it. I hope you don't mind doing that, but I think it's needed.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I know that when the paper was under development, I shared aspects of it with our students at the University of Essex, and I think there was a lot of enthusiasm for the original drafts as these ideas were developing. And I think when I presented it at the Frankfurt conference, which Liz ran, the reception was good. I mean, there were other events and other very interesting and important talks going on. But I think for the people who were there and provided feedback, it did resonate with some people. Now, in terms of the reception online, and just speaking very frankly, it could be bad timing on my part, because Robin asked me for the particular dates of when I wanted to run this forum, and I gave them to her, not knowing that it's going to fall during the period where the US election was happening. So I think that's an oversight on my part. Having said that, Andrew, it's been relatively quiet, and I think you pinpointed this in your most recent response, asking whether or not our community of Jungian academics and scholars are at a point where we have to start beginning to address some of these issues and being transparent about perhaps some of the systemic and institutional racism that's really occurring both out there in the world and in our field as well. And maybe there's a need to kind of put these statements out there for the sake of accountability, because if you don't have these statements taking an anti-racist approach, then it still remains invisible, and then people don't talk about it. So in response to your question there, Andrew, I think there are some ideas brewing based on this experience that might get put into another paper. So reception, it's been medium. I mean, not many people have reached out to me, and that does make me wonder whether or not, like you said, people truly understand some of the ideas that are coming out there. But to be honest with this paper as well, although it's coming from a feeling place, it's important to me. It was very important that I wrote this for myself and for my family. But there's definitely room for development, because if anything, I was just touching on many, many things, and they were intersecting in many ways, at least in my mind. But now I think perhaps it's time to be a bit more focused and to really kind of push open some of those doors.
It's interesting, isn't it, that in American politics, whatever word we use, racial hybridity is much discussed. The vice president to be, and in many people's minds, a very possible president, comes from parentage from Jamaica and India. And in India, they are celebrating her, not Joe Biden. And she's married to a Jewish man. So it's in the zeitgeist. I think it was, yeah, maybe not the best timing to expect anybody to focus on anything other than getting rid of Trump, which also meant stopping thinking about Biden, his record, and what's going to happen next. But okay, it is what it is. But I think you, as so often, for example, with your theory of Jung's history, Jung's historical theory, you're really onto something here that is of wide significance. But it's not going to achieve wide significance if the people amongst whom it has landed don't get it or don't read it, because it's got a difficult, a smelly message for Jungians, I think.
No, I appreciate that, Andrew. I really do. It's a, you know, it's a vote of confidence in me, and I guess just to keep going until people begin to hear. Yeah, it's a tough place to be in, especially because I'm in the midst of this tackling racism group at the University of Essex as well, and I know we have some Essex colleagues here. But you know, very briefly, in response to the death of George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, countless others, there was obviously a lot of movement around the world, but even at the University of Essex and in Colchester, and in response to a Black Lives Matters event in Colchester, this conservative arm of one of the groups at the university came up and put out some really offensive tweets, which then galvanized the vice chancellor to put together this tackling racism group. And slowly but surely, I worked my way into a seat of power, let's put it that way, and visibility, myself and my colleague from Language and Linguistics, Hannah Gibson. And it's been a really frustrating process. And I think, kind of speaking to what Andrew's doing, it's fine to do something at a theoretical level, but more and more I'm realizing that the theory needs to be backed up by some kind of activism or some kind of proactive action. And what I'm encountering right now is like, fine, we have all these ideas, we have this energy, but then the energy gets killed, because what you run into are the systemic barriers that will say, oh, we can't do that because, you know, we need to take an account of this policy. We need to recognize that if we're complaining or if there's a racist complaint that's being generated, we have to preserve a certain anonymity and we can't speak about the other person. So there's all this kind of goodwill and energy to implement, if you will, an anti-racist stance. But my fear is that it's a lot of tokenism. And you know, if you really want to change things, it has to be a combination of theory plus practice. And I think perhaps maybe that's the next stage for the paper, or for my own work, is that right now, this is just a theoretical sketch. It doesn't lay out necessarily and concretely what needs to be done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
I guess if I can come in here, Kevin, to some extent, I'm full of admiration for what you've written, but it is pretty theoretical. Mm-hmm. And what I found a little difficult is to integrate the understanding that you've given me, and with the sense of what it is to parent. And perhaps I ought to mention that I have children of mixed race and 2 new grandchildren, likewise. Thank you kindly, sir. Thank you. Wonderful experience. 80th birthday, and within a month, 2 grandchildren. Enough of that, but it's exciting. But that is kind of my point, which is that the inner need to, which I find very emotional to speak about, to bring up one's children, to then find out all over again very late in life, being a minor input into the grandchildren, is all encompassing. And needs to be so with a disposition such as her own, which is not to say I don't worry about them or haven't worried about them, because the children are now well into their 30s, not children at all. So I think I'm saying that in this aspect of my life, intellect is, and I'm not distressed by it. It's almost displaced by passion, by the sense that children need. I perhaps ought to say it. I was a single parent too. That the children need everything I can offer them. So hold down a job and look after the kids. That's life. Anyway, so that's a kind of slightly guilty apologia for a kind of inadequacy. And yet it seemed to me that the way that bringing children into the world, then looking after them, of course, bringing with my wife at the time, obviously, is all consuming. So I think I'd better shut up now. Listen.
No, thank you, John, because it is all consuming, and that's why writing doesn't get done. I'm at least excusing myself for that. But no, thank you, John, for sharing that. And as I said, when the paper was devised, there's just so many things going around, being a new father, and really looking at this idea of being a good enough father, and knowing that, at times now, when I looked back to my relationship with my own father, it was very stressed at times, and he didn't spend enough time with me. But I can look back and say, well, you know what, our assessment of our fathers, it's usually pretty harsh. And it's usually when you become a father yourself, you realize more and more, you know what, he didn't do too bad. He tried his best, and hopefully that kind of comes with time. I think what was really distressing for me at the time was realizing that I was projecting a lot on my son and eventually on my daughter, of guiding their life. And I still see that, even some of my responses, let's get them the right books to read and to frame their understanding. And I think there comes a point where you have to put it out there, but ultimately you're guiding them to kind of make their own choices and providing that framework for them, if you know what I mean. But what I found, John, was at that time, maybe unconsciously, I actually started watching a lot of martial arts movies again. For some reason, Bruce Lee just came into my life again. Had to go back, get the 4 movies, get the special editions, watch the interviews. And I asked myself, well, what's actually going on here? And the theme that really came out in those films is vicariously living out that fantasy of having experienced racism recently, and the need, if you will, to kind of reverse this position of power, which arguably in Bruce Lee's films, he's exactly doing that. He's fighting the Japanese, he's fighting the Westerners, and there was that kind of satisfaction. So I think the danger for me there was that, am I projecting that onto Eric? What am I putting into his mind? The way I'm even, the stories that I'm choosing, the way I'm guiding him, how is this me dumped into Eric rather than, again, building a knowledge base for him where he can kind of make his own choices. And I think part of the process of writing the paper was an attempt, perhaps not a great attempt, to kind of withdraw some of those projections a little bit and say, you know what, Eric, this is my shit that I'm dealing with. And if you want to watch Bruce Lee, great, but it's a much more complex story, you know, than what is actually being put on film, and the way indeed his image, his masculinity has been used by both, I guess, the Chinese community and the Chinese American community as well.
You've drawn your back. Good. If I might, just one brief comment. I think I did sense some anxiety in the paper, and it makes me look forward to your next draft, your next reworking of it.
Thank you, John.
You're very welcome. It's, every now and then you're dropping out, but I heard all that you said.
I might jump in if nobody has a comment at the moment.
Marissa.
Okay. I just wanted to draw attention, especially given this past week in America, to a statement in your paper where you say, I must reiterate, while my experience of my children is a catalyst for deeper reflection on larger themes, they and other multiracial children cannot be wished into becoming transcendent thirds or children whose role it is to mediate culture. And I feel like that moment, and I'm sure I've already mentioned this to you, Kevin, but it just seems like such a delicate handling of not only this like tendency in the Jungian community to just idealize the hermaphrodite or anyone who's somewhat liminal, or any symbol that's somewhat liminal, but also this kind of constant pressure on people of color to take on this position, take on the activism, and be the ones pushing this forward over and over again. And I mean, I think there might be a tendency, especially now in America, to assume that now that we have our first VP of color and a woman of color VP, that this is like resolved in the same way we thought it was resolved when Obama was elected. And I guess that was a really broad sweeping way of saying, of asking you, and if you're comfortable answering the question, of how in the Jungian field can we avoid looking at this moment as some sort of resolution now that we've gone from our trickster figure to our weird week of indecisiveness and just tension between seeming opposites and settling into a new administration that is multiracial. And I guess I'm just curious, like, what changes you'd want to see in the Jungian field to kind of carry that forward and have it not be on people of color in the Jungian field.
Yeah, no, thank you, Marissa. Lots of things kind of swirling around. I mean, this idea that we live in a post-racial society just because, you know, the US hired a Black president, it's all done with. And then you see someone, you know, rise like Trump. And I think Andrew helpfully posted a video, and I've responded with another video on Cornell West, just calling it as it is, that the reality is the people that you've put in power aren't necessarily the ones who are, you know, who are anti-racist, you know, they're for big business, the military, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we have to kind of be a bit cautious, be a bit realistic. Yes, it's a joyous moment for many, many people, but the people that are in power now are not perfect. And I think people have to take that in mind as we move forward, not to kind of throw their own projections on this new administration in the US. Some tangible things, I think, Marissa, you know, I spoke briefly in my in some of my responses about decolonizing the curriculum. And I think we need to come together. I'm talking about Essex, I'm talking about our colleagues at Pacifica, I'm talking about the training institutes as well, that we need to come together and take and be very vocal about an anti-racist stance and being clear how we're trying to overcome that within specifically the trainings. Now, I'm not a therapist, so I'm going to need help with this, obviously. But there needs to be that next movement, as I said, towards a more kind of proactive and activist approach to it. In terms of the academic side curricularly, it's it's more than, I mean, the time has come to decolonize the curriculum. How we do it, I've got some ideas. And these are things that I've been developing slowly but surely, but not knowing necessarily where they were heading. And now I think there is this narrative, there is this drive to start systematically unpacking what we've been teaching. And as I said in my response, it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's not just pointing the finger at Jung and said, you were a racist, not good. We're not teaching you anymore. It's absolutely not that. I think there is so much richness in Jung. And I think what Mark pointed out as well, that within Jung, there can be the seeds of something more plural, as Andrew has talked about in the past, and something that we can move forward with. But it's about kind of finding what those elements are, of learning what the core assumptions are, or the core definitions that are leading to these more problematic results or ways of thinking within the field, and then to begin to deconstruct that way. So it needs to happen at the realm of theory. It needs to happen at the realm of the topic itself. So looking at Jungian and post-Jungian approaches to race and racism. And this is only something that I introduced into 974 a few years ago. So we've got colleagues who are doing this work. We need to look a bit more at Jung and Fanon, which Michael Van Noy Adams wrote a whole chapter on. I forgot when the book was published, but it was a brilliant chapter. We don't see much about that. We have Fanny Brewster, we have Alan Vaughan, we have people in the field. So it's about deconstructing the ideas. It's about putting and shining a light on the people at the forefront who are working on this particular topic. And then I think the final point, there has to be something tangible. There has to be some kind of activism that, something proactive, a movement that we're working towards that is going to hold people to account. I mean,
can I speak up?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Hi, it's Jean Lull in Baltimore, Maryland.
Hi, Jean.
I'm on the East Coast. I live in a big city that's now predominantly African American. So as a community, we're very engaged with these problems. And I'm 78 years old and married to an Indian, and I have mixed race. I have mixed up children and a child and grandchildren. So that your paper has really struck a nerve on so many levels, and I really value your effort to be academic while at the same time starting from the personal autoethnographic approach. My husband and I are reading. We have about 40 books that we're reading on racism and the history of the Christian church as a racist institution and sort of imperialist colonial institution, because he grew up in the Methodist Church in North India while I was in Wyoming putting nickels in the collection plate to be sent to our missionaries in India. And so we're engaged in our community, we're engaged in activism and in historical study. Our church community is doing a deep historical study of racism in our particular denomination and has adopted a proposal for reparations. And we're working towards reparations within, specifically for our community. I've been thinking back over my experience with Jungian analysis over many years, and I realized that sort of coming into analysis in my 30s as a person who was living hybridity, I don't think there was anything specifically in Jungian thought that helped me to make sense of that, except, and I think what it gave me was the habit of paying really close attention to what is actually going on. And that is, what did you dream? What happened over the breakfast table? What did your neighbors say to you? What happened in the shop when you walked in with your dark-skinned child? What is the child experiencing at school? why are people, how are people treating her at school? But down to the fine detail, it's so important. I've been trying to understand, why did I come out of my particular upbringing with an openness and an eagerness to meet the other? Why did I, at 21, get on a plane and fly to India and spend a year there studying and teaching instead of going to graduate school in English literature? What took me there? And why did other people in my family take a different path? And I guess that's what I'm really wrestling with. What are people afraid of? They're very, very concretely from moment to moment, because it keeps changing. This is what I really like about your paper. I mean, this is one of the things I like about it, is that you keep emphasizing how the situation keeps moving. Things keep changing from moment to moment and person to person and year to year. So that I just want to validate that emphasis on the details of what is going on, along with the overarching theoretical study that you were just talking about, and the activism, because the activism has to be rooted in this self-examination, paying attention to what's going on in one's own life and in one's own neighborhood at any moment. I haven't written in yet because I have too much to say, and we're in the middle of the election that highlights so much the importance of what you're talking about, the fear of hybridity that has just completely overtaken our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean, for your comments. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Stephen, you are welcome, or Steve, sorry, I apologize. You're welcome to ask your question.
I just wanted to pick up on a point that Jean made and also link up to some of the previous comments about Kevin's paper perhaps being a little bit on the more theoretical side, because I didn't read it that way. I think one of the reasons was that I was at the Frankfurt presentation, and Kevin did something there that had a tremendously powerful impact, and it's the thing that I think really stood out from the whole presentation was good. But when I'll briefly tell you what happened. Kevin went through the Baker's story, but didn't tell us about the ethnicity of the person who had an argument with his wife and then abused Kevin. And he went through the whole story, and then sort of, I don't know whether it was deliberate, there was sort of a pause, and I can't remember exactly what Kevin said, but it was something like, I guess you all thinking this woman's English. And we all sort of, well, yes. And then it was Chinese. It was somebody, it was a Chinese Mandarin lady, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And what that did was it made us do this immediate self-examination that Jean was just talking about. Because instead of this being, a theoretical presentation, it was one stage towards us by being an auto-ethnographic explanation. But then suddenly it was no longer even to do with Kevin and his experience, it was to do with our experience and our response to that story. And I think it was very powerful. And I think therefore that, when I was reading Kevin's paper, that's what I remembered from that presentation, the thing that really stood out. And so, I suppose if there is a question from this, it goes back to what you were saying, Kevin, about, the need for some kind of activism. I mean, activism as trying to put a message across is really difficult. I think what there needs to be is that opening up, that recognition of our own biases through encountering something that is confusing, that has actually pulled the rug from underneath our feet. And it's very difficult to get that across in a paper. And I don't know how you get that across in a program, or whether you've actually got further ideas like that on how to achieve that within the anti-racist program at Essex.
That's a really good question. I'll have to reflect on that one, Steve. I don't have an immediate answer to that, but I'm happy you pointed that out, because what I really wanted to try to emphasize, again, as Jean pointed out as well, is that racism takes many forms. And it's not the sole device, if you will, of whites oppressing people of color, or blacks in particular, or minority ethnics. We have racism within the East. So if you look at how the Chinese refer to the Japanese, well, there's racism there. If you look at how the Chinese refer to white people, they literally call them ghosts. It's called guailo, and there's obviously then connotations to that. And even within China, I know, like, just based on my experience, that my uncle used to make fun of a very particular dialect within China. And then it was quite ironic that he then actually married someone who was from that specific area and spoke that dialect. And it just kind of brought home, the reality to me that, racism, it kind of transcends boundaries. It's sneaky, it's mercurial, it's everywhere, to a certain extent. But what it just reminded me of is that we can't, you talked about the persecutor and the victim. And I think it's potentially very dangerous for people who are the subject of racism to always then take the stance that we're the victim, without shining a light on themselves and seeing how racism is perpetuated and experienced within their own communities. And I think, one thing that is very potentially powerful, and I found it in Kendi's book, is that he was very open about his own racism, about how he viewed other Blacks within the US, and also many of the racist views upon which he was initially building his ideas that he had to forego in due course. So I think, if anything, we have to have a lot of tolerance for everyone as we kind of go through this journey of seeing and building, if you will, what an anti-racist stance actually looks like. And one thing I would really, point out as well, and this is something I constantly have to work on and to come to terms with, is that when you're living in, you're part of a family that is mixed, you have to be very open to the possibility and find the space to discuss how racism even manifests itself in a family. So, in theory, my wife, who's white and British, we married each other because we love each other, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not enough in the sense that we still have to be very vigilant that even if you have a relationship built on love, built on connection, built on rapport, racism can still sneak into the conversation. And it's about that bravery, if you will, to kind of address those issues right then and there. And we've had some very, very fiery conversations regarding that I won't kind of get into too much detail here. But I think we always have to be vigilant that even in loving relationships, that racism can still manifest itself. How do we have difficult conversations about that? How do we address that?
That was great, Kevin. Anastasia, if you'd like to make your comments, please.
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm in America. Please excuse my appearance because I was out last night pretty late celebrating the election results. So I was like reaching for my phone at 9 a.m. I was like, okay, here we go. So Kevin, actually, when I read your paper, I cried because I haven't read anything about this. I haven't seen it, and I felt like it was so important for you to write this as at least such a great starting point. Because even when I was studying Jung, I didn't find anything on this, and this spoke a lot to my experience. I'm Mexican and American, and growing up on the south side of Chicago, which is incredibly mixed with a lot of different people, between Black, Mexican, Italian, Irish, Polish. These are the demographics that I grew up with. And all of us were assimilated, me and all my friends, we were all whatever our background was, plus being American. And I felt like growing up, I never really knew what to identify with. And like, I also knew that having, you know, a white mother and a Mexican father, and my father was like, you know, born in Mexico, but incredibly proud to be a Chicagoan. That was always the thing with my family. Everybody was really proud to be from Chicago, but not everybody was that proud to be American. So then there was also that. And so when I was reading your paper, I was like, oh my gosh, like all of these things that I'm sure, you know, my parents were very unconscious of happened. And you know, my father, I'm white passing, but my father is not white passing at all. And, you know, growing up and witnessing me as a child, witnessing the racism that my father was receiving, and kind of the thought process that I would have in those situations. I remember a time, so like I cried actually the point, I think Steve is his name, who said that story when you said that you're probably thinking this is a British woman, but then it was a Chinese lady. And that really struck me because there is really a particular kind of racism that is just now being touched on in like, you know, like in the American conversation, is this racism in the Latinx community. White supremacy permeates almost all cultures, and especially in a place in America where like racial hybridity is like almost everybody's experience here. And I have experienced that a lot within Latinx communities, you know, people, you know, discriminating against, you know, their own people. And it's like, excuse me, what? Like, you are a person of color. Like, why are you doing these things? Why are you saying these things? Perfect example. The Proud Boys is a group that's now being very spoken about. And a lot of people are like, oh, it's not a white supremacist group because there's an Afro-Cuban chairman in the Miami chapter. And I got in an argument with a bunch of people on Twitter because I was like, BS. I was like, this guy being a part of this group does not mean it's not white supremacist. I was like, first of all, the guy is white passing. It's like, second of all, he's born in America. I was like, and third of all, I was like, you know, we know that people can be of a certain group and still have, you know, white supremacist views. I thought that your paper was very timely personally, and maybe I'm seeing it from my American perspective. And I was protesting up the wazoo this summer. And so my circle of people who were also in my activist circles, we've been talking so much about how white supremacy has, you know, seeped into how we were raised, and you know, seeped into the things that our parents would do to protect us from receiving racism. For example, my father did not teach me Spanish, and he told me and my sister, he's like, I'm not teaching you Spanish because I don't want you to have an accent when you speak English.
Mm.
And I think about that still in my life, because I'm like, wow, he literally didn't teach me that because he wanted me to sound more white. You know, and he thought that would make my life easier. You know, people would receive me a different way because of it. So, you know, while I was reading your paper, I was just also so grateful because I was like, wow, finally somebody is like, has tackled this. You know, finally somebody is starting to tackle this. Because, you know, it was hard for me to figure out my identity. I know who I am now, I think, but of course it's always a journey. But I feel like, you know, for a long time, like I didn't know how to tackle that, and I appreciated like how you did it in the paper. So my question for you, because I had like a whole experience while I was reading it, I wanted to ask you, because I know when we write things like from our heart, and I felt like you wrote it from your heart as well. How did it affect you, like from, you know, from before you wrote it to after you wrote it? what kind of changes did you kind of go through, if that's not too personal of a question?
No, thank you so much, Anastasia, and thank you so much for sharing your experience. And what really resonated with me, two things. One, how we can identify with the aggressor in many ways, that there is this urge, if you will, of wanting to be white, wanting to fit in. And I remember when I was at the University of Toronto, I used to to see a lot of the international Chinese students kind of sitting at segregated tables and speaking Chinese. And at that time in my life, I always, said to my friends, I just don't like this. We're Canadians, we're a cultural mosaic. And, we have to kind of buy into this. And if anything, we should be conversing in English, et cetera, et cetera. And I look back and I wish I could shake my 20-year-old self and how silly I was. But I think there is this process of development and growth that needs to occur. This kind of understanding more and more, our privileged positions. And what struck me as well about what you described was this almost kind of sense of loss. And I'm thinking of kind of Freud in Mourning and Melancholia here, that, in mourning, you don't know what's been lost, whereas in Melancholia, there is a sense of what you've actually lost. So for me, what struck me was that this sense of language, the sense of identity that's based on language, there's this kind of intangible until you pinpoint language, or you solidify, if you will, a bit more your identity. There's always this kind of almost kind of transgenerational transmission of something that is haunting you, but you can't quite pinpoint what it actually is. In terms of how I felt, I was just relieved to finish writing the paper at a very practical level, because I was, Andrew knows, I was moving at the time. Liz had invited me to the conference and I needed to get the paper done. And so there was a sense of relief in that way. But I think the whole process itself, I was really careful with the words and how I wrote the paper. That's what I remember, that I spent a lot of time scribbling things out, shifting things over, changing things, because I really wanted to find the language to capture what I was feeling and what I wanted to say. And admittedly, and this is, from my point of view, it's not the most well-structured paper. I know that I have several of my students here, and I always say, where's the argument? Where's the structure, et cetera, et cetera. And now you can come back to me and say, well, Kevin, that paper has no structure whatsoever. Is it still a paper? I think at the end of the day, it's made me more aware of how I want to move forward with my own career, and not just working at the level of the theoretical, because we write what's around us. We everything we write is a snapshot of who we are at a particular point in time, but not who we are indefinitely, because that's always going to be shifting. And I look forward to the point where I look back and say, wow, I wrote this when I was in my late 30s, when my children arrived. What was happening at that time? What were my anxieties? As I think John rightly pointed out and picked up on, what was consuming me at that particular point, and how was I using my own writing and research to kind of express that. And if anything, writing the paper has made me much, much more aware of the anti-racism movement, of Black Lives Matters, and really hammering home the fact, and I know Andrew's been saying this for years now, that working on yourself and working on bettering yourself has to translate at some point in time in working for the betterment of others and working for the improvement of situations for others. And more I'm beginning to realize that. And it frightens me, because there's so much within your own bubble that you have to take care of. But realizing now that not only do you have a responsibility to yourself, to your family, you have a responsibility to all others. It's challenging, it's scary, because the work at Essex, it's taking up so much of my time. And you have to strike that balance between still being there for your kids, but really kind of doing this work that needs to be done, and to, you know, to put it out there. But thank you, Anastasia, for that question. It's hopefully helped me concretize myself, you know, what I got out of writing the paper.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I also just wanted to say too that I think it was an incredible starting point. And like while I was reading it, like I just was like, well, I honestly felt like empowered afterwards. I was like, this is important. This is really important. And I actually read half of it to my mom because, you know, she had Mexican white children, and she was like cooking dinner while I was reading it to her, and she was like, oh my God. She kept like turning around to me, kind of like her reactions. And it was just a great experience. So thank you for it.
Thank you, Anastasia. That's made my day. Thank you so much.
All right, I'm really sorry if I mispronounce your name, but Paya Popovich?
Yeah.
Oh,
Hi.
wonderful.
Yeah, I was hey, I was wondering quite similar thing, like being able to talk about something so personal, and especially like your own children and stuff like that. And Anastasia said, you know, it made me cry. Do you think it's even possible to achieve something like that without putting out something so emotional? Like even for you, like finishing the paper, did it have like a different impact on you? Because obviously you published papers before, but like this one, I think that it was a little bit different for you personally. So and then knowing that it's gonna be reviewed after, you know, after you publish it, and then people are gonna read it, and did it feel different knowing that people gonna actually review like you personally as well? Like did it, you know, just the feeling at the end, was it way different? Do you think is it important when you write an article that, you know, this emotional personal factor is also involved to make it such a big deal? Or you know what I mean? Was it?
Yeah. No, thank you, Pia, for that. Yeah, wow. I mean, that's the power of autoethnography as a method, that ultimately it's about yourself, but it provides this framework that allows you to delve into your personal experience, but using it as a springboard to comment on the larger collective forces, if you will, that are shaping your identity and shaping that experience. And Andrew and I have supervised projects, PhD projects, and I know several of our colleagues before, students, followed an autoethnographic approach. So I think it is the power of autoethnography, but equally, there is a real danger that autoethnography can really slip into this very narcissistic opportunity, if you will, to kind of narrate one's experiences, struggles, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very fine line to balance, and that, you know, ultimately autoethnography needs to speak to the collective. It needs to link that individual life as one amongst many, and in this kind of web of historical forces that are actually shaping you. Now, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but the one thing I struggled with throughout, and I discussed it with some colleagues as well, is how much do you disclose of yourself in an autoethnography? And I think it was a really delicate balance to try to strike. So a part of me needed to mourn the different papers that could have been written. And I will disclose this. When I first wrote the paper, I actually had several dreams that spoke, that you know, I referenced it very briefly, but I actually went into detail of those dreams, about my son, about what I thought it meant, et cetera, et cetera. And it was really difficult for me at that point to take it away. But equally, there was a part of me that had to assess, well, how is Kevin going to be judged? How is this work going to be judged? If we're presenting all this personal material, I'm exposing a lot of myself. I'm exposing people to things that maybe I don't even know, but as an experienced analyst, they might have a window into my soul and see what's actually happening. But it is that very fine line to straddle, if you will. I don't know whether those things will ever find the light of day, but I think, you know, within autoethnography and looking at a Jungian approach to autoethnography, I think there can be a space for that. But I think people who approach this method and way of working, they need to be comfortable with the possibility that you're putting yourself outside in the world for scrutiny, for examination, and that really determines the how much you actually kind of put out there.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's for me personally, that's the most admirable work, when you see that person was brave enough to put themselves out there. Like literally anyone can read this paper now. And for me, it's also the juiciest type of paper to read about, because it's so personal. So yeah, it for me is like, it's really, really nice. And just another thing, about racism and everything. So I'm coming from Slovenia, the tiniest country, and I always thought that maybe there's gonna be the most, the racism is gonna be the most present, just because there's only white people basically, and obviously the other is the dangerous one, the something you don't know. It could be the shadow and stuff like that. So I thought that maybe Slovenia is gonna be where the racism is gonna be felt the most. But then being in the UK now for 2.5 years, I was shocked realizing that I experienced it more here. And I always thought, oh, okay, so children grow up here, they go to primary schools, seeing kids from other cultures, it's not the other, because it's just there. You grow up seeing all of that, but meeting friends here from other cultures and talking to them and seeing how much racism is actually present here, I was shocked. And seeing that Slovenia was actually not that bad, I realized that maybe there is just the ignorance, because there is not part of their daily life, so they're just ignorant to it. But here I was shocked how present it is. And then my question basically is, like, why racism even exists? Like, how, like, seeing it, like seeing other cultures and then growing up so close to them, like, why is the other still so dangerous to you? Why does it scare you that much? And why someone is gonna be scary and is gonna become racist, and someone will actually love this part of the otherness? Like, for example, I have my Jungian personal analyst. When I was sharing my dreams, often I dream about Black people, for example. And I know that in our lectures, sometimes you said that Black people could be, for white person, could be their shadow. But she very quickly saw that definitely that's not the case, that it was actually more of roots and enthusiasm and like something else, something way more positive. And I was thinking, but why? Like, why is Blackness something that it's so positive for me? And I was not even growing up having that very close, because in Slovenia it was just white people. So why am I like that? But why is maybe my neighbor is so racist? Like, I don't understand why, basically, or maybe why my shadow is gonna be some other culture. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, thank you for your question, Pia. It's really difficult to answer, because I think, as I think we were discussing previously, how, racism itself, I mean, is it about prejudice? Is it about people not liking other people, or are there other factors involved that converge around racism to create the racist moment, the racist act? And I think that's really important. So we can't really delve into perhaps what, an overarching answer as to why people react in the ways they do. But from what you're describing to me, I mean, if we're living in a cosmopolitan city, we have to think about economics as well. And is there a perception that people who are outside taking certain jobs from very deserving people who are born there, raised there, et cetera, and that's a real concern. So I think any approach we take needs to take this more intersectional approach, where we're not just looking at race in isolation, perhaps as a fear of the other, but it's race in conjunction with other fantasies and fears around economics, around gender, et cetera. And if anything, what it really highlights or brings home is, what do we fear about losing about ourselves? What is it that we've kind of projected outwards and split off to a certain extent that we kind of can't accept? And again, that is perhaps the other, but there's so many other factors that intermingle and mix with it to make that racist encounter, that racism, what it actually is. So it's difficult to pinpoint, Pia.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Because also I thought, because I'm at the end of the day, I'm an immigrant here as well. You know, I'm not from the UK, but it was kind of sad to see that because I'm white, I didn't experience any kind of like my experience in the UK is just brilliant. But then I have my flatmate who was born here, UK completely, but you know, she's black and her experience is just not as nice. And I don't know, it's just sad to see. And at the end of the day, I always then say it's not even about racism, it's just white supremacy and like how, you know, why do you think you're better? Like, just, I don't know, like probably 2020 was the year where we were talking and discussing race the most and white supremacy, and even my eyes opened up about a few things, and I realized I was ignorant as well, and I felt ashamed not realizing it before. But it's great, like thank God we were talking about it, and now, you know, I don't take things for granted anymore, because I'm like, oh my days, maybe my journey was so smooth just because I'm white, you know. And before I thought, yeah, I'm that good, I did it, well, maybe someone with the same mindset was stopped because of their color or something else, you know what I mean? So yeah, 2020 quite a great year in that sense to open your eyes a little bit more. So
yeah. Thank you, Pia. And the one thing I want to say is don't feel ashamed, because we're, you know, this journey that many people are taking to being open to the power structures, the systemic racism. Not everyone's going to start at the same level, and if anything, you're here, you're talking about it, and you're willing to engage, and we're willing to learn together. And I think part of what D'Angelo was saying is that, you know, in order to build that anti-racist stance, we need these communities of an understanding where people, if something is, you know, offensive is said, then be open to being challenged, be open to accepting, and focusing more on how, let's say, any comments make others feel rather than your intention behind it. So you may not intend to harm anyone, you may not intend to, you know, to step on anyone's toes, but again, focus more on how it's making the other people feel, makes the other person feels, and that in turn kind of builds our racial stamina so that we can have these conversations and we can kind of move things forward. Now, the one thing I want to say in response as well is that I used to have this fantasy, and again, after perhaps I left Canada, that Canada was this kind of really great place, you know, that Toronto is completely woke, because when I was there as a student and growing up, I barely had any racist incidents that I can remember at all. So there's this kind of romanticizing of the place that I left. And once I came to the UK, all of a sudden, you know, I'm kind of what it feels like, at least in my mind, to be center of attention and the subject of these racist attacks. Now, very funny enough that when I finally went back to Toronto to visit, and my wife was with me, the kids weren't born yet, I literally had 2 racist incidents in a row on 2 separate occasions that completely broke my fantasies of what it meant to be Canadian, etc. And it still happens everywhere. I mean, one in particular was where someone, a really big white male, like, you know, really built strongly, pushed his way onto a bus as Grace and I were getting on. He called me a gook. And many of you know that the term gook is obviously referring to Vietnamese specifically, and the term was used during, you know, the Vietnam War quite a bit. And I mean, yeah, I lost it. So that was one incident. And there was another where a mother and daughter, in a very passive way, and say, oh, watch out for these Chinese people, they just push, you know, watch out for them kind of coming through. And, you know, it's really distressing stuff. But again, I think it can happen everywhere, Pia, and there aren't pockets of enlightenment, if you know what I mean. I mean, certain conditions and environments might breed or might bring forth a bit more awareness, but you know, pockets of this, it's everywhere. It goes back to the systemic racism and institutional racism that structures, you know, our society. So I know there are other questions. So thank you, Pia.
Thank you, Kevin.
I just want to check in, Kevin, because there are quite a few people who would like to speak, but it looks like we might go over the 8:30/4:30 cutoff.
Okay.
Are you okay doing that at all?
Yeah, I'm happy to take the rest of the questions on the list here, Marissa, and
Okay.
people can stay or go depending on how their time is.
Great. Asiel, if you're ready.
I'll try to be brief because I didn't have any question to ask you. I just want to tell you that reading your paper was very touching for me, especially because you were teaching me when I was at Essex, and I really wasn't expecting you to publish anything like this, talking about you know, racial hybridity, and I'm very much as hybrid as they come. My mother is from Greece. I was born in Greece, but I grew up in Saudi Arabia. My father is from Saudi Arabia. And I think having a framework, an academic framework, that's also in the sense in therapeutic in a way, in the realm of psychology and Jungian psychology and all of these things, I think is fantastic what you are doing, because I never thought there could be a framework in a systematized way that we can talk about these things and kind of deepen our understanding of these concepts that are very hairy, especially when we're talking about racism, because sometimes even if you're against racism, your terminology and the way you talk about things can be offensive to some people. And sometimes you have to also think, like, is it worth it being offensive sometimes or not being offensive? So it's very complicated, and having a serious systematized framework and having clear understandings of the concepts you're using and building these concepts is very important, especially in psychology. So thank you very much, and it was very touching, unexpected, really. I wasn't expecting it at all, and thank you so much.
Yeah, because I'm such a cold-hearted bastard when I'm marking.
No, I was expecting you would be writing about history and more historical.
No, Asiel, thank you so much. I mean, really touching, and thank you for sharing your own experiences and your own background as well. And you kind of touched upon building a framework and the way forward, and this brings me back, I think, to something that Andrew mentioned, is that we've started the conversation, but other people need to take this up as well, and that includes white allies, because we can't leave the labor to those who identify as Black or minority ethnic to do this work and to kind of forward the conversation. If people are committed to it, it takes everyone, it takes the entire community to begin discussing this and moving it forward. So thank you, Asiel.
Thank you.
All right, Catherine.
Hi, Kevin. I'm going to say I was also very touched by it, and I am really pleased that you're focusing on, well, I took from it the parent-child sort of relationship. And I'm coming at this now from a different point of view, because my husband and I are both Irish, but we ended up living in England, and our children ended up being brought up in England. And I always told them, you're Irish, you're Irish, you're Irish, you're Irish, you're Irish. And now in their mid-30s, one of my daughters very, very passionately told me, but Mum, I've lived my whole life in England, and you're not taking any regard for that. And I realized that, yeah, I was dismissing that whole side for them and the importance of that for them. So it's just another aspect of identity, I think.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It reminded me of a part of the essay that had to be taken out. And I want to thank Liz for being so understanding about what I need to say in the words I need to say it in. But there was some quite heavy editing that was involved. And basically, I mean, I put it in the footnote where I put the Chinese characters for my kids' names. And for me, at least, it was very important for me to give them that Chinese name. I mean, if you want to think in more kind of sci-fi sense, has anyone read Ursula Le Guin and the Earthsea quartet. Anyone? Oh, fantastic, Robin. So the first one is basically Get is just chasing his shadow. And there was this idea about the real name, that if you know the real name, you have access to something magical or a part of that individual. And for me, it was more about planting a seed, that I wanted to plant a seed in that curiosity. Well, why is my name, why do I have a Chinese name? Why is it the fact that, you know, when they read out their names in class, they have their Chinese name that's phonetically spelled out as part of their middle name? And a part of that for me, Catherine, was just to kind of plant that seed of curiosity, but not necessarily directing them of, you know, you need to kind of figure this out. You need to find what this aspect of yourself is all about. And that was me, again, just trying to kind of give them a hint, a little nudge, but not trying to direct them in that particular, to that particular exploration, if you will. But we'll see what they choose. And I think that's the real difficulty for me. Yeah.
Interestingly, Kevin, I wanted to ask you about your daughter's name, Kira.
Yep.
Is that how you say it?
Yep.
My daughter's name is Kira.
Mm-hmm.
Kira.
Mm-hmm.
But Kira is an Irish name, C-I-A-R-A.
Mm-hmm.
And I think K-E-I-R-A is an anglicization of an Irish name. And the Irish name means black-haired maiden.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
What do the characters mean?
Very interesting. So her characters, Lo Wing Han, it means something along the lines of, you know, elegant, graceful, which initially, there's a lot of factors when it comes into a Chinese name. Initially, we wanted to bypass that. So I needed obviously some help from my parents to look at the characters. My understanding of Chinese is quite basic. So my parents kind of gave me quite a few names to consider. And when my wife and I looked at this, I was like, wow, this is really kind of typical stuff. The girl is elegant. You know, there was these poetic names of, you know, the dove flying by the sea and all that kind of stuff. And we wanted to rubbish it. And we say, we want to call her heroic. You know, we want to call her heroic. And that's what we want her to be defined as to a certain extent. But it was this complex mix of the middle character combined with the third character. So if anyone knows a bit about Chinese names, your last name always comes first. The middle name is the character that goes across all the generations. So if you look at my family, myself and all my cousins who are Lus will have the same middle character. The middle character plus the third character is actually what gives the name meaning. So in very general terms, Catherine, there was a mix of the kind of flow of the name itself, and then we had to compromise with the meaning. So that's why Kira has that particular Chinese name. For the English name, Kira, we were very deliberate with that because she was born with a mop of very, very dark hair. And she was very little as well. So, you know, just sharing this, the pregnancy wasn't very straightforward. A lot of issues that perhaps were more related to the NHS and how they were monitoring Grace and how the baby was developing. But Kira came out and she was very, very small. There were a lot of, you know, odds against her. And when we came to the name of Kira, little dark-haired one, it just fit perfectly. And we said, you know, we have to go with this. The other name that we were juggling was Eliza, Eric and Eliza. That sounded quite nice. But we went for Kira.
But not with the Irish spelling.
No, not with the Irish spelling. Yes, with the anglicized spelling.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like Cheryl had to leave, Kevin. She said
Okay.
she will email you her response. But Barbara, if you're ready.
Okay, yes. So Kevin, first of all, thank you for this paper that felt really respectful and delicate. Such a difficult theme. to me, this question of identity is such a is the big question mark in my life, and so the fact is that my experience with that is that identity is always into others. So my experience is that, for example, I don't know, my Jewishness comes to the forefront when I'm reminded of my Jewishness somehow. So it's a little bit of the play you talked about, you know, the persona, that which I feel a little bit, I would put it in a different way. I would actually probably use the term ego states. And they come to the forefront according to the, you know, the situation, the circumstances, and the person or the people you're dealing with. And so for me, I find it difficult to relate to this very, you know, this idea of identity politics, because for me, identity is really fluid. The boundaries are very fluid, and the danger of identity politics, what we may call, I don't know, may call it the shadow side, is that then it's a, you know, we take some dogmatic positions. And I have the feeling that actually doesn't help. So I don't know. I mean, it's very difficult. I'm sorry, you know, because it's really a big question for me, the question of identity. Because I can be, as you say, different persons according to the circumstances, and that is not a persona to me. That is an ego state. They are all genuine part of myself. Sure. And you describe them as persona. I would call them ego states. And it's a play, you know, it's a constant play in relation to others. And so we are responding, and we are constantly negotiating our sense of identity in relation to others, and others do that as well. So it gets constantly recreated, reshaped according to the situation. Yeah, so I don't know if I managed to explain myself.
No, thank you, Barbara. Thank you so much. And, you know, I mentioned Barbara's upcoming paper as well. I have a lot of respect for your work, Barbara. You know, the Jewish complex, whose complex is it, a relational perspective. I know that's coming out in the IAJS soon, so look out for that, Barbara. Such, you know, really groundbreaking and very touching work that you've done there as well. Now, the reason why I used the word persona was I was actually quite moved and influenced by Hopke's redefinition of the persona. I can't remember what year he published the book. It's quite a while ago. But basically, for me at least, and based on my reading, he's trying to recuperate a space for the persona, because in many ways, it's not, I don't want to say it's a dirty word in the Jungian world, but it's usually this kind of social mask that we wear, a more superficial level of how we relate to one another. And what Hopke is saying was like, well, if you look at the persona, if you define it as the social archetype of that which bridges the individual to the collective, that in many ways, that idea of the persona is integral. Because as we both know, Barbara, if we're looking at individuation, it's relational, right? We can't individuate unless we are in relationship to other people. And if the persona is that bridge to that relationship and to the other world, then equally it has a really important role to play. And what Hopke is talking about is rethinking the persona and its importance So rather than seeing it as an archetype of, let's say, a social mask that we can kind of take on and put on given the certain circumstances, we can have more integral personas that are actually reflections of the self, reflections of who we actually want to be and who we have the potential to be. And if we see the persona in that light, then it's absolutely necessary, and it's absolutely something that's positive and something that we can work with. So maybe I didn't make myself clear enough in my response that my understanding of the persona is actually moving towards what Hopke is talking about in terms of the persona. That if anything, if we're talking about identity politics and the persona, we are still moving towards a more authentic self through the persona. In other words, the persona actually really matters. It's not the only aspect of ourselves, but it's certainly a more important aspect of ourselves that perhaps doesn't get discussed more, a bit more about. So that was where I was coming from in terms of my understanding of the persona.
I'm gonna have to read it, to read
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe Andrew knows a bit more, but that, and other colleagues as well, but it's been published a while ago, hasn't it? Hopke's book on persona. I can't remember the date, but I thought it was a great book, actually. Oh, wait, Liz is looking. Liz, have you found it?
I'm just looking for it, okay? When I find it, I'll let you know.
Great,
I'll
fantastic.
go looking, but I've got it on the shelf somewhere.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And Vicky, yes, reclaim the persona. Many people have inadequate personas. I'm a friend of Robert's. I think he nailed it. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Vicky Joe. Great book.
Sean, if you're ready for your question, sorry, I missed your name in the chat.
That's okay. Hi. I don't often sort of join in or speak, but I wanted to thank Kevin because opening the journal and reading that paper was quite a shock, actually. And having known you for a couple of years on the MAJ program, what came through was just how hurtful that experience was for you. And I guess my own potted history, my family is Welsh, which is not very far. We don't have to cross the sea to migrate from Wales into England. And I settled in Essex, and I've lived here in the county all my life. And I just felt so sorry. And then it started to connect with my own family's, I would call it racial abuse, I would. The way in which my family was treated, first coming to London, then going to Essex. And it got me thinking actually about a book called Insufficiently Welsh by Griff Rhys-Jones, about his experience, the same, being raised in Essex, Welsh family. And he went back to Wales to try to sort of reclaim his Welshness and found that he couldn't. And it's the same problem. We don't know where we fit. I can manipulate my accent very easily. My accent was rubbed out from a very early age. So the Welsh accent went. Everything to fit in, everything to comply, everything to become English. And the shame, the stigma of being different and of not fitting in. And I actually felt quite angry because I thought, Kevin is experiencing what our family experienced, some 50, 60 years ago. And nothing has changed. So first I want to say thank you for waking me up to that. Because not having moved, having stayed put, now we see new entrants, other people who are taking an active choice to move somewhere new, to settle. And I'm in danger of being, if you like, a passive recipient of new people coming into the country, into the county, and thinking, they don't belong here, they don't fit. And I think a lot of it has to do with this movement, whether through choice or necessity. Some people move, some people get up and move and go someplace for a more interesting or a better life. And others don't. And those who don't somehow resent that. And I can't figure out why that is. But that's the impact that your paper had on me. When I opened the journal, thought I was going to read some long, interesting papers, and bang, there you were. And right at the front of this quite shocking story. The other thing, just to sort of wrap up my piece, I think that probably a lot of people have similar stories to tell. And you point to activism. I actually think that the more people tell their stories, the more I describe the English colonization of Wales and what has happened just across the border and what's still happening now, the more that everyone tells their story about what happened in the playground, in the workplace, in the street, I don't think that there's much need for even a lot of theory around it. Just more stories coming out so that more people begin to realize not just the scale of the problem, but I think the variety as well. Probably we all have stories to tell that are perhaps not as bad as Kevin's, but something similar. And I'd like to see more of these stories come out, because that is how you grip people, through the narrative. I don't think it's going to happen through diversity training somehow.
No, thank you so much, Sean, for your comments, and thank you for sharing your experiences as well. I mean, in one of my responses, I can't remember if it was Mark or to Steve about decolonizing the curriculum. And, and I take what you're saying, Sean. I mean, we've looked at our regulations at Essex and say we need a better, unconscious bias training, et cetera, et cetera. But it's about then ensuring that it's good enough and then people take it as well. And you have to kind of change minds, and it's very difficult to do it if it's a mandatory training, put it that way.
Yeah.
And I think changing narratives, restoring the methods of oral history, of autoethnography, we're certainly moving in that direction, because these are methods that are at the forefront of destabilizing more traditional ways of knowing. And a part of decolonizing the curriculum is to empower people to take those approaches, to be unafraid to take those approaches as well. As we said earlier, there's a lot of complexity involved. There are issues with autoethnography, but if we're going to begin to decolonize the curriculum, it's not so much about the topics, it is, but it's what we privilege as a research method, as a valid way of knowing, as a way of coming to some form of knowledge and producing knowledge in some way, shape, or form. And we know that within therapy thinking, psychotherapy in general, restorying, telling different stories about ourselves, about our past, I mean, it's central. It's key to healing in many respects. I'm reminded of a Canadian series, TV series. Of course I am, everyone, a Canadian series called Being Erica. Has anyone seen Being Erica? Oh, Liz, fantastic, one person. So it's about time traveling therapy. And, it is a bit strange, but basically Erica in each episode is given a chance to revisit one of her major wrongs, or a list of major wrongs that she draws up in her life. And there's this kind of fantasy of, if I only can get back to that past experience, and if I could redo it, then I can make sure that bad thing didn't happen to me. And when she goes back, what she realizes is that you go back, you try to change the way you acted, or you're trying to avoid a result. What happens is the same thing happens anyways. And what's more to the point is how she restories herself, how she kind of goes back and tells a different narrative about that past, how it's affected her, how it's shaped her. And that's where the healing actually begins for Erica. It's that process of restoring, of telling gentler stories and kinder stories about your past, and being, you know, less guilty about yourself, being nice to yourself, if you want to put it that way. And I think in that regard, therapy thinking has a lot to offer to these methods as well. So for me, that is a starting point if we're looking at potentially how analytical psychology might contribute to these larger initiatives. What do we do well? And what can we teach these other disciplines? Restoring and what we do within therapy is a big part of it. Thank you, Pia.
So there are no other questions in the chat, but if anybody, I mean, I think that's a perfect note to end on personally, but if anybody else had any questions, Robin?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. And my comment is inspired to decolonize the journal, our journal. And that's all I want to say. I mean, with the context in which you've led this seminar, I presume that we all know what that means. And if you, however, if you have any ideas, please send them to me or to Eric about that's beginning to happen in terms of, as Steve knows, you know, shifting to more artistic oriented seminars. That's one way. But I would really encourage your input, because and your hive mind, because I certainly can't do it alone. I'm unable to do that alone. And so it's a way we can become a subversive enterprise in our organization through our journal and through our seminars, and of course on the listserv, in the ways in which we talk with each other. So thank you very much, Kevin.
And thank you so much, Robin, for that idea, that initiative. Let's definitely be in touch. And as I said earlier, I mean, just, you know, responding to the questions on the list has given fruit to another paper, Robin. So that's going to be coming your way in due course. It's coming.
Very good. Paul, I see that you have your hand raised. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I was just thinking, beautiful article. Thank you. It was startling. Well done. You're unbelievably hairy.
Happened overnight.
Even by my standards. I was thinking of, you know, some of those 70s various visions in different ways. We are so, well, so many of us are so accustomed to problems of racial othering. And of course, my department at the university is doing a lot of this now too, because we already do a lot of cultural theory, but there were special meetings this summer in response to current trends and this kind of thing. But I was also remembering the opposite vision. Not even necessarily the sort of idealistic 70s versions, though many of them exist, and many of them were quasi-Jungian, very sort of California, people like Ted Sturgeon or Joanna, pardon me, what is her name? Anyway, the assumption that a society would be multiracial and multi-identity, and that it would look at anything else as peculiar, right? And it also goes to when people will fictionalize the Roman Empire or ancient Sicily or places that are sort of transitional crossovers, Shanghai, points where cities or areas or cultures that do become absolutely accustomed to multiracial experience. You know, good old San Francisco and LA by normal standards. And when that is seen as the norm. So I was wondering if there was any way of sort of reimagining things in a somewhat different direction. I know that when I moved to Northern England, you know, the largest minority in the Northeast is Chinese. And of course, pardon me, I'm a little groggy today, not Mandarin speaking Chinese. I'm thinking people who are immigrants in mid and late 20th century. And it's about 3% of the population. And black people, there aren't any black people, right? There are a few. I have a few friends. We had one black student in my department this year, which after years in Los Angeles is like, it's weird, right? So there was this something about what do you see, what do you experience. I know that in the UK, Londoners always say, oh, you know, this is so, their experience is so different. And there's something about, rather than just sort of fighting against an assumption of monolithicness, I'm speaking very awkwardly, I suppose, but if that counter vision, which as I say feels so familiar from a lot of 70s science fiction and later in different parts of the world, I think of Brazil, Hong Kong, you know, places where it's just normal. Does that offer anything? Does it give us anything in terms of vision, or even anything, I shouldn't say archetypal, but I will,
of how things could be, in a sense?
If that were assumed to be the norm, is what I keep thinking. Because at points in my life, I know I've been in places where it is the norm. And then you go to places that are, you know, one thinks of, and pardon me if anybody here is Brazilian, but the American view of Brazil is, this is how Brazil is. And Brazilians will tell us, oh yeah, racism is a problem in Brazil, but also multi-ethnic roots, multi-ethnic backgrounds is really normal.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. And I think, you know, it is the case more and more in pockets of the UK. Now, I'm very wary of trying to do what I've always spoken against, which is to kind of pinpoint a figure or one particular instance as, let's say, representative of an entire experience. But baby Archie, who is Prince Harry's boy with the American actress, what's her name?
Megan.
Megan.
I really have I don't have any proper names in my head today.
Yeah, Marissa, Megan.
Meghan Markle. I feel like I should know this. I'm a terrible millennial.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a symbolic shift. I'd be very careful to say it like that, but it certainly kind of captures, Paul, what I think you're trying to describe is that the trend is changing, and for it to happen within the royal family, you know, irrespective of what Harry's current status in the royal family is, I mean, is potentially transformative. Yeah. How that trend plays out, I don't know, Paul, because as you said, London is one entity in and of itself. You know, if I'm looking where I'm at in Kent, you know, it's yeah. I mean, my kids are the only colored kids you could see for a very long, you know, a very long stretch, if you will. And even within my son's school, it's not the case. So it's hard for me to look at what that potential future might look like. And I feel my place right now is kind of trying to change the reality itself. It's you know, it's hard, but you're right. I think there has to be some kind of vision or idea of the self, of, you know, a collective entity of how things might be, and there might be things that we can kind of pull away from that. But if anything, Paul, and you might experience this as well, especially at your university, I know it's the case in my university, I'm too busy putting out all these little small fires, if you will, to have that vision sometimes. But I think what you're saying is actually really important,
because there are places where it is literally, there are many places, many places where it is literally different. So
thank you, Paul.
Any last comments? I believe there's no more in the chat, so if anyone would still like to contribute.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Hi, Kevin.
Hey, Facundo.
Yeah, I do agree with everyone that, as I said to you, your paper is very moving and very touching. And you know, I came from like more hard science psychology background. So I think it's awesome to have a framework that allows us to bring our own emotions, our own, you know, personal history and everything. So it's great for us Jungians, or more Jungian oriented, you know. I was thinking, like, I've been having these thoughts in my mind lately about what is maybe the best way to, let's say, to do activism, you know, because I also agree that maybe we Jungians are more like abstractly oriented, and if we don't take concrete actions in the real world, it's just, you know, some kind of intellectual masturbation or something like that. But I also do feel like lately, as these issues of, let's say, racism, feminism, and so on start to become like massive, there is also this phenomenon that, you know, I feel like many people or massive groups of people, which maybe I can include myself in these groups, tend to assume superficially or in a hollow way these ideas, you know, more in like a persona way. And they do not take it like in a serious way or deep way. I don't know if I make myself clear in this way, but if we think it in a more Jungian perspective, this is the worst thing that one can do, because there's not real consciousness about what the problem is, and one just assumes certain ideas because they are socially correct, or they're, you know, I have to put forward these ideas because I have to be socially acceptable or something like that. So
yeah. And I think what you say, Facundo, it reminds me, you know, I shared that that link to Cornell West and his assessment of the Kamala Harris and Biden ticket, and it almost seems what they're doing is kind of hijacking, if you will, that race card, so they get the vote because it's still better than what Trump is actually offering. And I think the question you're asking is, then how do we do it with integrity? How do we do it where we come from a feeling of conviction, if you will, and we're not just donning that persona because, you know, it's cool to be woke right now, if you know what I mean. You know, everyone is kind of treading this line, and we feel that we have to be very careful, police ourselves in terms of what we say. And there's certainly a conversation to be had about that. I know that in the Times Higher Education, there was an article recently about freedom of speech, where, you know, if we're kind of moving in this neoliberal direction, that you can't, you know, there's no speaking out against, or sorry, there's no racism, there's no gender bias, etc. It kind of closes the conversation in many ways. And my response to that is, again, it's so complex. It's a difficult conversation to have. It's difficult to know when you're doing something with integrity. And I think it really boils down to the individual of how they want to be active. So I know that for me personally, to be standing at a picket line with the placard, it just isn't me. It doesn't resonate with me. But looking at my institution and working within my institution that I currently belong to, that works. And I think it's finding the ways that you can kind of express yourself integrally to match with, if you will, these ideas, if it is the case that you feel compelled to, and that you're kind of following this line of thought. But yeah, no, it's a really important question, Facundo. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
Amr,
very much.
oh, sorry. Amr, if you'd like to ask or comment.
Hi there. Good evening. Thanks, Kevin, for sharing that paper. I read it before as well, and, you know, a bit of a different version. And I remember it getting a very heated reaction in discussion. And, you know, going through it again, I kind of my position, my reaction to it shifted. It's very vulnerable, and it's, you know, there, it's very heartfelt. But when it comes into the context of decolonization, I just wonder, what exactly does that mean? in practice. And something funny's happened this week. You know, my family, my cousin's wants to marry a white girl, and that's the first in our generation of our family ever. You know, that's the first. It's a big thing for us up here in Scotland, and so we've had our first white girl come into our extended family. And, you know, thinking about the paper and having to deal with that situation, it reminds me a lot that, at least in my South Asian background and culture, there's still a lot of unsavory aspects of those cultures that come in contrast when we come into a Western country or we immigrate. So these things don't get brought up in academic discourse or in class or in papers or discussions in academia, because there's a shying away from talking about the more unsavory aspects of the other culture. And there seems to be this kind of anti-white or this kind of narrative that gets pushed quite a lot in academia. And I just find it a bit strange now. And that wasn't really my position last year or 2 years ago even. So I'm just wondering, when you say decolonization, how do we also address some of those aspects of Asian culture that, you know, we don't like or we don't find so savory in a kind of Western kind of setting?
Yeah, thank you, Amber. Thank you so much. I think you're right. And I think it, you know, again, it was only one sentence in my paper, but I wanted to be very open to the possibility that, you know, Chinese people are racist as well, racist against white people and racist against people within the culture that aren't from their specific region or the mainstream Mandarin dialect. So I certainly think that there needs to be a space to be open to those discussions, and not seeing racism specifically as something that white people do to colored people or people who are not white, i.e. Black people, minority ethnic people. In terms of decolonizing the curriculum, you're right. It's a very vague term. And when you get this prompt from, let's say, an institution that you belong to, say, you must all decolonize your curriculum, everyone's kind of scratching their heads nervously. It's like, oh my goodness, what do we do? What do we do? And I think at those moments, it's about coming together collectively and knowing or exploring what it means within your specific department. So what it looks like in PPS is going to be slightly different from, let's say, our acting school, which is East 15. And they've put up some, you know, amazing, actually, and thoughtful, I would say, proposals. So the one thing that East 15 is focusing on is about speech and the dialects. So people are kind of using RP. Hello, do you want to say hello?
It's nearly ready.
Okay, all right.
Hello. Oh, he's gone all shy. Hi, Eric. Hello.
You okay? This is Eric.
Sorry
about that. Eric's Eric. You want to say hi to everyone? Okay, I'll be out in a sec, all right? All right, buddy. I'll be out in a sec.
Get off the cat.
Nat, get off the cat. Sorry, he's been reading Oi Cat. Sorry about that, Emmer and everyone. So when we're looking at decolonizing curriculum within East 15, they were looking at the accents they were actually teaching and realizing how skewed that actually was, that there was this leaning towards, you know, RP and expression. And what they've brought in is actually an external consultant to look at other equally important UK accents that they can then integrate. Then they're also looking into the plays that they're running, the roles that they're casting. So there is a lot of self-reflection, and you know, all of that is part of decolonizing. But that again is very specific to East 15, and what that's going to look for us is going to be very different. And I think, Emma, we're still in the process of figuring out what it means within a kind of psychoanalytic school or department or therapy in general.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And, you know, it does sound very challenging, and I don't envy your position there. It was just to kind of, you know, point out that within diasporic culture and generations after, there's also a rejection of their own culture and a need to get into mainstream Western culture, whatever that means. But there's also this kind of, you know, talking to other white friends who are also into Jung and Jungian thought and the different psychologies and philosophies that surround that kind of circle, are getting really weary of anti-white sentiment. So I just think it's a balance to kind of keep in mind. But thank you for your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Emmer. And I just want to thank everyone for engaging today. I know there are some questions I haven't answered, so please, everyone, you know, join the discussion or just email me. As Eric said, it's time for dinner. So I can't forego my responsibilities of being a good enough father to my little multiracial child. So thank you so much for coming today, everyone. I really appreciate it. And we will post this video in due course.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And yes, everyone, do respond to the IAJS forum post, because I'd love to keep this conversation going. It's incredibly important.
Take care, everyone.
Your
Bye,
boy
Kevin.
already knows this, but he was insanely
Thank you.
cute, of course.
What's that, Paul?
Your boy already knows this, but he was insanely cute, of course.
Lovely. Thank you, everyone.
Bye,
Cheers.
Kevin. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.